areas of Africa if we want to. We can see how the discussion goes and take either focus as we proceed. When we think about the issues of relief and development, which is where we're really focusing the discussion tonight, whether in Ethiopia or in Africa more broadly, there are multiple positions that people take about the linkages or contradictions in those issues. Let me characterize three positions that I'm sure are represented on this panel, but also in the audience as well, that are typically held. The first one is the separate position. It sees people holding this position see relief as distinctly different from development. Relief is short-term. It's undertaken with a degree of urgency in response to an emergency situation, and because of those special conditions, there's little opportunity or necessity for thinking about development yet. If one wants to do development, one does it later, does it with more planning, does it carefully, does it over the long term. The second position that some people take on understanding this relationship is the continuum perspective. That is to say that relief and development are on some continuum, that even as you're doing relief, you're sort of thinking ahead and planning your development approach, setting in motion some of the things that are going to come along on development, but that they start with, you can often start on a short-term basis and move into the longer term and make linkages that way. The third position is one that I've characterized as the identity position. It says that there's really no reason to do anything but development. That you can do development in the short term, you can do it under urgent situations, you can do it in an emergency, that is, you can do relief developmentally, or you can do relief anti-developmentally. The point is always to be doing development, whether you're doing it under an urgency situation or a long-term careful planning situation. On this panel, we'll see people playing with those different elements and what they mean as concepts for the way in which we operationalize work. When we asked this panel to prepare itself, they received a letter in which they were asked to address 5 questions, and I think a number of the panelists are going to focus their discussion around these 5 questions, so let me just tell you quickly what they were. The first question is, what are the tensions between relief and development? The second question is, what are the complementarities between relief and development? The third question was, how does your institution, the institutions they represent, make its decisions regarding its allocation of resources and other attention to relief and development, the relief development emphasis? The fourth question is, why is there a serious food shortage in Sub-Saharan Africa today after the major efforts of 84-85 in relief assistance at that point? And the fifth question is, what has been learned from the 84-85 relief experience that has changed approaches in their institutions or even elsewhere? The approaches can be either conceptual approaches, perceptual, or operational approaches. I'm going to introduce the 5 speakers now with a sentence or two, and then they will simply speak in order with no interruption or questions from you in the meantime. The first speaker, then we will come to open discussion afterwards. The first speaker is David Holdren, who is the director of Sub-Saharan African Programs for Catholic Relief Services, which most of you know as a major non-governmental organization based in New York City. He is the person in the position at CRS who currently is trying to help CRS think through the way in which it does relief and the development implications, to make the connections between relief and development for that institution. And he says he'll be speaking from the perspective of the difficulties an institution faces in trying to do that. Next speaker will be Ronnie Brauman, who's the president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. It's based in France. His characterization of his agency is that it does relief, only relief. It does it in the short term, it does it over the long term, but it does do relief. He says that he sees relief as a political issue as much as a humanitarian issue, and he'll be speaking from that perspective. The next speaker is Trevor Gordon-Summers, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Regional Bureau for Africa of the United Nations Development Program, based in New York City. He says, of course, that the UNDP is in the business of development. Whatever it does development. It does development under any circumstances, and in fact, it must work also with all the member states of the United Nations. He comes from the distinctly development perspective. The fourth speaker is Jason Clay. He's the Director of Research for Cultural Survival, which is based here in Cambridge. Jason says that from his experience rather broadly and quite deeply in the Horn of Africa, he sees evidence that both relief and development often involve violations of human rights, and that's the perspective he will take. And the final speaker will be James Kelly, whom we are fortunate has gotten here in spite of adverse airplane attempts to keep him away. And he's the former director of operations for the U.S. Interagency African Famine Task Force, currently has his own consulting firm near Washington called AFR Incorporated. He says that he will simply take the position that we must do away from famine and that he's dead serious about that. The process that we'll take now is that we're going to limit these speakers to 5 to 7 minutes, and I'm taking my watch off so I can monitor you. And we're going to be tough about that because we do want to have as much of an open forum as we possibly can. After they each speak, however, we are going to satisfy their needs for the things they had to keep unspoken by giving them a chance to interact with each other for a little while, because often panelists never get that chance. They're, the last ones get to say something about what the first one said, but the first ones never get a chance to say about what the last one said. So we'll give them some chance for interaction, and then we will open up for questions from the audience, and we will try to end at 9:30, which is the Kennedy Forum policy. David.
Thanks, Mary. I don't know how many out there are familiar with CRS and its involvement in Sub-Saharan Africa. I just want to give you a brief background in case you're not. There was this marriage in the mid-50s between Public Law 480 and the creation of large U.S. agricultural surpluses and nations in Africa emerging from the colonial period, often with disruption to their ability to be able to feed themselves. CRS got into this arrangement from the beginning, and it basically went around the border of the continent of Africa, deep water ports, and opened up general relief programs for the distribution of PL 480, U.S. agricultural surplus, Title II, to beneficiaries in, I think, about 20 countries by the mid-60s. We were very operational then, more so than we are today. We're still operational. We have food programs today in 14 countries. We have 800 employees that work for CRS. About 750 of them, their work is related to the distribution of foodstuffs. About 1 million beneficiaries, and beyond that, in our emergency efforts in southern Sudan, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, and Burkina Faso, we are involved there also. I just say that as a background because in 1983, a new man came on at head of CRS, and it was his intention to look at root causes and to diversify. We have a constituency such as it is that we were not going to abandon our efforts in general relief and in emergency work, but we wanted to pay more attention to addressing root causes. We're relatively new to that in Sub-Saharan Africa, July of '83. A good deal of my work overseas, I've just come to headquarters about 6 months ago, has been to try to influence our country programs to start doing or addressing root causes, encouraging self-sufficiency among institutions and counterparts in Africa. These are some of the differences that have been pulling at our agency, and this is the first question we were asked in this letter that we got to address, and that was the tensions between relief and development. On the relief side, and I'm talking about Catholic Relief Services and its constituents, the relief is generally today comprehensible to the majority of our donors. Development is often difficult to grasp, especially when we're talking about training programs, which are a big part of our development program. We have visitors overseas who represent our donor community. They invariably want to go and take a look at our relief work. Relief is extremely expensive. Inland transportation, tremendously expensive. Development, we are finding it's often difficult to spend the allocated monies in the time period that donors expect us to. Relief, we have strong connections with the United States government and the EEC. And development side, we have nearly all our development efforts are funded through private donations. On the relief side, our accountability is defined very strictly. On the development side, we have much more latitude with our budgets. Relief, we have low administrative costs compared to program value, and you see it in all the ads, 3%, and It's understood that that's important to some people. On the development side, we have very high administrative costs, and rightly so, compared to program value. On the relief side, a large headquarters unit for logistics, shipping, finance involved. On the development side, it's nearly all decentralized to the field, project design and evaluation. On the relief side, we have an abiding day-to-day relation with the host country government, sometimes morning, noon, and night. On the development side, it's occasional. And it's very occasional in some countries to send when we have gotten out of a food program and decided to do development work, we've been asked to leave the country. Now on the programming side, just some changes here. The programming and the relief, as it is practiced, and I'm making a distinction here between as it might be practiced in the future or should be practiced, but as it is practiced now, we basically focus on the transfer of material goods, and there's a strong theme of dependency there. Programming on the development side, the focus is on self-sufficiency and independence. We have large impact in our relief work. Regardless, good or bad, we reach millions of beneficiaries, and there's changes in those people's life. Some people say for the good, others disagree. On the development side, maybe because we're new and we're not as polished, but in any case, the impact has often been questionable. We've had a lot of failed projects, as a lot of other NGOs have. The relief side, it has been easy to measure. Development, much harder to quantify. Personnel, key to this whole thing in our agency. How do you work with personnel on the relief side? It's a hierarchical type of structure. We have low turnover over people who work in relief, strong negotiation skills, and a low ratio of technical people to drivers, warehouse people, etc. On the development side, we have a collaborative type of system, not hierarchical, high turnover of personnel, facilitating skills rather than negotiating skills, and a high ratio of technical people to non-professional people. Another differentiator on the relief side, our major counterparts or people that we collaborate with are our SIDSE partners in Europe, representing the major Catholic donor agencies. We are isolated on the relief issues generally. On the development issues, we have managed to coordinate with our partners, our European donor partners, quite effectively. Next question, I can see I'm running out of time, but the complementary links, this next question was the complementary links between relief and development. CRS does use emergencies to attract development funds. We can strengthen our relationships with counterparts through emergencies and enable us to do development. We've done it in Burkina Faso with Bell, we've done it with Caritas Mozambique, and we're doing it with the Ethiopian Catholic Secretariat. The situation requiring relief can, if studied, and I underline if studied, provide the basis for policy dialogue and projects aimed at root causes. Another thing we were asked to address in the letter we received was the institutional allocation of resources. I've said that out of 800 employees, about 50 work in development. Private monies, about 60% of our private monies go to development projects, about 40% to relief. All non-designated donations go to development. Special fundraisers go both to emergency and development. CRS right now pushes development as far as the donor community allows, but material transfer is still best understood by our constituency. Following question was, why a serious food shortage after the 84-85 relief efforts? Well, it's because the relief did not address root causes. It kept some people alive, hopefully for a better day. The resources available and the inclinations of major donors and host country governments to address root causes was generally absent. And finally, we were asked about the lessons learned in 84 and 85. I can say this, in our agency, in our institution, the following lessons were learned. To protect development efforts, we drew off our personnel and our material resources from our development efforts to be able to address the problem in Ethiopia, and we paid a big price for it in the countries where we're trying to do development. That substantial resources had to be allocated to tracking U.S. government-funded assistance. We are still cleaning up the financial accounting from 84 and 85. The donors are told up front that monies are going to be reserved for development that they give for crises. We made the covers of most national magazines because we decided to take about 35% and put it for long-term development of the emergency aid that we got. Next, that only one person can direct the action in an emergency. Emergencies attract a lot of experts, a lot of people that want to make decisions, and oftentimes people are getting different messages out in our field offices from different people. Be aware of the political context. If there's anything that I struggle with right now as we go through this Ethiopia thing today, it's the tremendous political implications of everything we're doing up north, working with the ECS and the government of Ethiopia. The importance of working through a counterpart. The only reason we're able to work in Mozambique and in the northern part of Ethiopia is because 95% of the work done up there is done by Eritreans, the Ethiopian Catholic Secretariat. And finally, using early warning systems much more effectively than we've used them in the past. Thank you.
You did a remarkably good job, David. Thank you. Ronnie Brahma.
Thank you. Well, because of the jet lag and the time limitation, I'll try to stick to the question by reading my paper. But first, I'd like to say a preliminary remark. This is not exactly what I told you. Relief is not a moral and political affair. I think that relief proceeds from a moral stand, whereas development is a political and cultural process. And this is the reason why we stick to relief, and that we feel that development is not in our field of competencies. First, tensions between relief and development. Those tensions exist, obviously. Once they are identified, they can be dealt with as long as there is a political will to do so. But the problem is that some Western governments don't seem to be aware of this problem. The main and classical example, which is still a current problem, is food aid. Crop prices drop, as everybody knows, when relief food is distributed. Many farmers are discouraged to work in their fields because they know that they won't get good prices. The logical consequence is that they choose to cultivate just enough for their own subsistence. This makes the rural society vulnerable. And of course, this is extremely counterproductive. Over the past few years, the European community and many private voluntary agencies have tried to deal with this problem by buying local food and distributing it to those who need it in case of famine, and avoiding to distribute food aid. In emergency situations, food aid is generally required. We will see that even in those situations, it is not always the case, and that problems can be dealt with much more cleverly. But beyond emergency situations, we have to keep in mind that relief can be harmful, and this is my main point. Let's take the example of the wells in the Sahelian countries, which was the questions. During the drought in the early 80s, many people decided that if the water was not coming from above, it had to come from below. Money and volunteers were sent to dig wells all over the place, in all the Sahelian countries. As a result, patches of desert appeared in some Sahelian areas because these wells attracted people and cattle in areas which were not prepared to accommodate them. Overgrazing, environmental destructions made internal patches of desert appear with very serious long-term consequences. And the Sahelian population is going to pay this bill for many, many years. Relief work should not be, as it is in most of the cases, just a matter of goodwill. It has to be professionalized and coordinated. Otherwise, there is a real risk of doing more harm than good. My second point is about the complementary links between relief and development. In my own experience, which is health, of course, I'm a doctor, there is no real contradiction. We establish long-term programs in a comprehensive approach and in close relations with the local authorities. Medical care, public health and training are the main components of our activities and seem to be efficient. In other fields, my impression is that the crisis situation that many African countries have been facing over the past years should be dealt with differently. The money for work system should be widely spread. If I can recall that the main system used so far is food for work system. water shortage means unemployed people. I mean, drought means unemployed people in the rural area. Those people can work if they are paid enough to improve the rural infrastructure. For instance, roads, irrigation channels, dams, reservoirs, etc. I'm not talking, of course, about forced labor, but retributed salaried labor. This method was used on a large scale in India 15 years ago with great success. During 3 years, the state of Maharashtra, which is a very large state, about 60 million people, suffered severe rain shortage. Very quickly, with an early warning system, the local authority took appropriate preventive steps by distributing money as salaries, of course, instead of Five minutes, okay. Okay, well, let's go back to the subject. They distributed salaries, they distributed money instead of distributing food aid, and the result was that they avoided those huge distribution centers which took place in Ethiopia, for instance. The main result is that after 3 years of severe drought, the food crops were very good once the rain came back, and now this state is producing surpluses instead of being dependent upon the international assistance. Besides the economic efficiency of the system, which is essential when we're talking of development, the human aspect is very important. The dignity of the human beings is respected. They're not transformed into assisted people. Third point, how does our institutions, MSF, makes decisions regarding resource allocation to relief versus long-term development? That's what the question. As a medical institution, our activities are both relief and development, if I may say so, but in fact, deeply, I think that it is mainly relief. Provided we work in the various fields I mentioned earlier. We work in emergency situations such as conflict and refugee camps and natural disaster, and we also run long-term relief programs such as bush hospital, rehabilitating health infrastructure in very remote area, and we also carry out immunization campaign. These last two components of our activity is between, I would say, relief and development. Fourth question, why is there, and I mean, I won't be able to address this question, why is there a serious food shortage in Sub-Saharan Africa despite the relief effort? I don't think that in 30 seconds I can address this issue. I would say in a few words that my feeling is that in most African countries, peasants are just not considered. Productions are not paid at a price which should be a real incentive. No serious efforts seem to be made in order to improve the agricultural technique. And now, the situation is extremely serious. Traditional techniques were quite adapted when the population density was below 40 inhabitants per square kilometer. In many areas, this threshold has been, the density of population is above this threshold, and we are facing a very serious situation, and all the observers are absolutely convinced that more than half of the African country will depend on international assistance up to the next generation. I'll conclude with the experience we draw from the period 85-84. What we learned in this period is that in those countries where a strong pressure is applied by the government on the civil societies, development is very low, is very weak. Rural societies rural people are not as stupid as the urbans think. When they find their interest, they produce. When they don't find their interest, they were just enough to feed themselves and become, as I said before, very vulnerable. But there is something else which is a question we addressed today. We can observe that some governments are producing now starving people and are selling them to the international community. Famine used to be, and still is, a technique of social control. It becomes now, in addition, a source of foreign currency. This is a real danger for the future of international solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. As Mary said earlier in the introduction, we're in the business of development. And although these days one is hard-pressed to give concrete examples in societies of development, we have to be optimistic about that. One would argue that to achieve development you have to have a degree of stability and a sense of security in most of the societies. But the fact that we do not have that uniformly throughout society does not mean that we cannot attack the development issue. Development is a complex, long-term business. We in the UNDP would argue that while we address issues of a medium to long-term basis, we cannot ignore the fact that many societies are caught in the problem of drought, famine, desertification, man-made disasters. We believe that we have to concentrate on developing institutional capacities within these societies. Only in that way will those societies be able to cope with the short-term emergency problems and begin to address the long-term development problems. As my colleague would have said earlier in the workshops this morning, we work with and through governments. That's not to say that we work to the exclusion of other development actors. We are currently involved in trying to develop greater relations with non-governmental organizations because we see that NGOs have a certain capacity to work at the grassroots level where development should take place. Unfortunately, in many societies, development is taking place in the urban setting, not in the rural setting. How do we develop these institutional capacities? Through, for example, if you look at from the emergency point of view, by developing early warning systems, food information systems, encouraging food reserves, all of these aspects, which address not only the emergency situation, but also the development situation. We're also, as far as emergencies are concerned, trying to assist in the resource mobilization. Many bilateral, multilateral donors who are willing to address emergency issues, but not development issues. This is certainly the case in Ethiopia, where we find that country X will provide resources for food aid or non-food aid, but will not provide resources for development. We're in the business of trying to encourage the debate, the dialogue, to bring those resources to focus on the issues, whether it is relief or development. We try to create in each of these countries a blueprint for the government to manage the process of development or to manage the process of their emergency. We go in and we help the government establish structures in the ministries at the provincial level. We help them to create mechanisms to coordinate the flow of resources, to coordinate the information, to determine what are the critical needs, where are they likely to be supplied, help them in very practical and operational terms to have those critical needs met by coming into the country through their ports, strengthen their logistics systems, to ensure that those needs of the critical or the areas where they're most needed, they can be met by bringing the various resources in. I think the important question that's asked in this kind of discussion this evening is, what about the links between emergency relief and development? Yes, it is true that there are tensions which occur between relief and longer-term development. It's obvious because in an emergency situation, resources are scarce, objectives are short-term. Initiatives which the government or the national actors would normally be able to take, they are unable to, and they become very dependent on external actors. There's an inability to plan for the medium term. But we believe that there are complementary links, and we believe those links grow out of a government policy. And I use the concrete example of Mozambique. Mozambique, which is a country being fragmented by the bandits as they're identified. But that's the same country that came to the international community a year ago and said, we want to adopt an economic reform program. And they adopted all the policies that the Bretton Woods institutions have asked them to do. Deregulation of the economy, removal of price controls, bring the currencies, devalue the currencies, all of these things. And we marveled at the fact that a government could be talking in such developmental terms while the prevailing insecurity in the country was of such a pitch that it was very difficult to guarantee that the developmental activities which would take place in any one particular area could be of a sustainable level. But nonetheless, because of the policies that they adopted, we believe that it is possible to work with them in developmental terms, in secure areas, while at the same time providing emergency relief. We believe that it is important to understand that there are root causes for the crises that occur on an emergency basis, and it is necessary to treat those root causes. If we talk about drought and the resultant famine, the inability of land to sustain development, we have to make the investment in terms of soil, water conservation. We have to make sure that we address reforestation programs. We have to address agronomic practices to bring the technologies that are necessary to make these communities much more productive. And that is an issue which we are addressing in a country like Ethiopia. But we are mindful of the fact that we have to work on two levels, both emergency relief and development. We do not have the luxury of ignoring one and working exclusively in the other. But we are dependent on a government to recognize that there is a relationship between relief, rehabilitation, and development. In the absence of that recognition, it is very difficult. We can understand why some governments are reluctant to link the two if they are starved for resources, as in the case of Ethiopia. The question is asked, why is there a food shortage while there's so much food aid? Quite frankly, I don't think that food aid necessarily contributes to solving the problem of food shortage. Food aid runs the risk of creating dependencies. Food shortage in Africa, and I think it is a major difficulty in Africa, is because there has been a concentration of policies, I think somewhat misguided, to meet the requirements for export crops. The very technology, the investment, the inputs have all been geared to export commodities, to earn foreign exchange, because that is necessary for import, for development. Which means that there has been a transformation of the food habits of many of the African population. And so that many of them today many African countries are unable to feed themselves, have lost the skills of domestic food production. It's interesting to note that in Mozambique today, there is a very serious attempt to reverse that trend. It's a discussion that they're having with the World Bank. The World Bank doesn't necessarily accept the policy of food self-sufficiency. And the Mozambicans are not naive enough to believe that they will have a complete nutritional balance from what they can produce. But they're saying that if they can introduce domestic food production to meet some of their basic needs, while not forgetting that they need export earnings, they can begin in the longer term to address the food needs. And this they're doing despite the prevailing insecurity by creating green belts around the urban areas and in the secure areas in the rural provinces to concentrate on new strains, new technology, new agronomy. In our organization, we have to be optimistic. There are realities in Africa. These realities, natural disasters, man-made disasters, but development is a long-term objective, and we have to think in those terms, in sustainable terms. We're optimistic. Thank you, Mary.
Jason Clay?
Relief and development takes place primarily in areas where there are famines, where people are starving, there's massive suffering. Relief to development, as a result, in Africa, has to take place in the ongoing or aftermath of war situations, war zones, whether it's in Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, or Sudan. What we're looking at is states that are ruled by minorities, where opposition groups are not allowed. Simply put, various ethnic, tribal, and ideologically opposed groups are fighting for control of states, separate regions, autonomy within states, or for the cultural identity of their own peoples. Relief and development in Africa today occur in this context. Famines often provide smokescreens for governments, minority governments, to move people or impose top-down economic structures. These chaotic situations give power to those who control central relief supplies. That's true of liberation fronts as well as states such as Ethiopia, Mozambique, Sudan. Relief, by definition, has to be rushed in. And then you begin to think about what you're doing and how to make sure that the help doesn't hurt. Development is just the opposite. Development's a thoughtful process. You do not rush in massive supplies if you want to create self-sufficient systems, which is presumably what development is. In addition, development requires very different skills on the part of the agencies that are administering either relief supplies or development supplies. Relief operations rarely produce the types of information necessary to identify the root causes of problems. I think this is a major shortcoming of the agencies that provide relief assistance. They're not trying to find out from the victims what it is that has caused them to be starving. Many agencies in doing Ethiopian famine assistance have made claims that they're attacking the root causes, yet none of those agencies, to my knowledge, do fundamental research on why people are starving. So it's, in my mind, impossible to say they're attacking root causes. If you're not trying to find out what the root causes are, you're kidding yourself if you say you're doing development. When you turn the NGOs that have been primarily relief-oriented onto development, when they begin to approach development, and in fact the U.S. government, as a result of shifts in hiring ceilings and various things, has shifted a lot of its foreign assistance through NGOs now. Few of the NGOs, I think, have staff that are trained to do development. Fewer still have the necessary guidelines for social or environmental impact assessments of their own projects, for cost-benefit analysis of the projects that they are proposing or that governments are proposing that they fund. They don't even have the, admittedly, I think, lax checklist types of guidelines that the World Banks or bilateral agencies have. It's our belief that relief is relief and development is development. In each case, you try to make sure that you're doing as little as you can to actually hurt the people you're supposed to be helping. We believe that in development, small projects designed and run for the most part, by the people themselves, and for the most part also paid for by the people themselves, are the only way in the long term to generate self-sufficient communities that are interested in their own development. This is virtually impossible in the middle of a war. So I think it's also virtually impossible to do development in the middle of a war. Let me just turn to some of the questions. Why is there a serious food shortage today in Sub-Saharan Africa? The answer is war. The answer is also that certain elite groups are attempting to maintain power, standards of living, and lifestyles in the face of declining economic situations. Everything that the Western agencies do through those governments that they represent enhances their own ability to control resources further. In terms of what we learned from the 84-85 famine, and I'll close on this, we have decided that as anthropologists, this is we at Cultural Survival, as anthropologists and researchers, the thing we can do best, and the thing that has been done least in the African famine situations is to give voice to the victims, to talk to the famine victims about why they're starving, and to make sure their experiences and concerns affect the solutions proposed, and that the victims themselves are involved to a great extent as possible directly in the solutions being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. James Kelly.
Thank you. My working title is that famine should be eliminated. It may sound as though I'm being cute. I'm dead serious. And if you don't think I'm dead serious, you can read a 150-page paper that's in the CFIA library over at HIID that I had the pleasure of writing when I was here at Harvard for a year in 1980. I've learned a little more, but the basic premises have not changed in what I wrote in the paper. I suggest that emergency campaigns are inherently flawed. There is no way to make them effective. The gentlemen on the panel have suggested, they've given, I don't think I have to go through the list, but it happens too quickly. You can't plan. The transportation network gets all blocked up. You can't get food to the remote areas. Invariably, the food arrives late. Every large-scale famine in history, if you check it, you'll find that there are huge stockpiles at the end of it that are not needed, that depress the local economy. You have a right to know where did I form my opinions about what I'm going to say, because some of them may appear a little outlandish. I was in charge of the relief operation in Mali in 1973-74 for the United States government. And that's where we were doing things like shipping food to Timbuktu on C-130s. For the next dozen years, I headed up development offices in AID, 3 of them as a director. In 1984-85, I was the head of the task force in the United States government to direct all relief operations in Africa from Washington. So these thoughts that I will get off are deeply held. The first thing I'd like to make clear, though, is that I in no way would denigrate the splendid effort of the relief agencies. Dedicated. They do the terrific work under very trying circumstances. I feel that it's the development people who are not doing enough to get rid of famine. Let me make a couple of quick distinctions. I am not talking about civil strife, okay? One cannot do much by way of planning or preventing that from the outside, as panelists have pointed out. I'm talking basically about what is famine disaster, where you have the result is either crop failure or something allied to that. It is what is called in the literature a creeping disaster. You can catch it in the creep so that you can do something about it so that you don't have an emergency campaign. Outside of civil strife countries, there is no reason why people should starve. We have a wonderful transportation system in the world. We can get food to them overnight in C-130s. This country is willing to do it. We've seen that repeatedly. If they do starve, there's plenty of food too. If they do starve, it's because some human is getting in the way, not allowing the food to get to them. Now, what is it that we should do? It obviously comes down to an early warning system. If we can have 8 or 9 months planning time, then you can get food into even the most remote parts of any country in the world. The problem is, in 1973-74, we didn't have the data to call it early enough, the donor world and the governments. 1984 and 85, there was data, but people wouldn't agree on it in the international community. As a result, there was a lot of quibbling, a lot of time lost, with respect to whether the indicators were right that famine was coming. They were right. Famine did come. So what do we need? We need an international early warning system whereby governments of the affected countries and donors will agree on the kind of data that is necessary and what is credible. Not easily done, because the information systems in these countries are still developing. Oftentimes the data is patchy, lots of gaps, etc. Some countries, the enumerators are not paid, low salaries, no petrol, etc. Some countries have a lot of data, but no analysis is being done. Other countries where the collection is being done, the analysis is being done, oftentimes the original questionnaire was not sufficient to really reveal the conditions on the countryside. So, the people in the capital city have got to be skilled at drawing information from inadequate data. And that can be done. People can pick up skills working with subjective data, even anecdotal data. But it's got to be brokered in the capital city with the government and the donor community so that there can be agreement early. How early do I mean? There's no reason why, if you have a database in country, and developing agencies do have databases, there's no reason why you cannot call it in May and say, these are the vulnerable parts of the country. If we have a bad rainy season, the people in this part of the country will be hurting, because we've followed them all year. We've done sampling. We know that they're going to be the first ones in trouble. And in these countries, you know where those traditional areas are. Am I over already? Sorry. But then you call it again in September. You take a look at the rains, after the rains, and you say, all right, bad rains. Send in the first amount of food. That can arrive in January rather than July as it's arriving now. Then you take a look at it in October and you ask for the second amount of food. It's just a cycle that gets you ahead of it. If the development people would concentrate on an early warning system, then we would have very little famine outside, almost no famine outside of civil strife countries. Amen.
As I said, it's now the opportunity for the panel to interact with each other. Does any of you have a question you want to pose to another? Jason.
I'd like to pick up just on the last point, that if we had an early warning system, we wouldn't have famine. I think that one of the major problems in Ethiopia in 1984, at least in some areas, was an early warning system that had been set up. Because the flip side of an early warning system is that you can also predict surpluses. And in many areas of Ethiopia, surpluses that were generated in the occasional good year were usually held buried in the ground as a traditional way of coping with the famines that were known to be coming. The early warning system that was set up with UN assistance allowed the government to see where there were going to be surpluses and take them. So that in '84, in particular in Wollo, and this was demonstrated by talking to refugees who came from Wollo, but also Ethiopian researchers talking to people in Wollo. This is one of the major reasons that there were food shortages in Wollo was the early warning system itself. So I think we have to be very careful about this. All these things depend on who's using them.
I'd like to react to something that I think Jason said.
Jim.
No.
Oh, sorry.
I think you made a point that food shortages occur because of war. Am I quoting you correctly? But I think one could argue that there are a number of countries which have reflected food shortages, although they've not had war. And there are some countries that have had war and have not had food shortages. I give the case of Uganda. In fact, despite the 10 or 15 years of absolute destruction that Uganda went through under Idi Amin and Obote, what have you, there was no massive starvation. It happened because the country is rich, and if you drop a coin, a tree will grow. So that I'm not sure that war is a factor. In the case of Ethiopia, I believe that they have had successive famines from as long as they have been recording famines in Ethiopia. They've been having famines. And even in good years, there have been food deficits in many areas. I believe that I would go along with what James is saying, and there may be defects within an early warning system, but It is not the fact that the early warning system in itself is deficient which causes a food shortage. It is the host of other technical issues that are not being addressed, that need to be addressed in a situation like Ethiopia. And I think that if we were to argue about what causes food shortages, there are a number of issues. There are incorrect economic policies, whether it be by the government of the day, by external agents, or what have you. Price policies are wrong. Distribution policies are wrong. The importation of emergency food sometimes creates a dependency. It disrupts the market. It disrupts the production systems. Inappropriate technologies or no technologies. The land itself is no longer productive. And many issues cause these food shortages. These are issues that can be addressed in technical terms and assisted by an early warning system, if efficiently designed and efficiently managed, can at least ameliorate the conditions, if not eliminate the famine. I'm not sure that it necessarily will eliminate the famine.
I'll just say one word. I agree completely with what you've just said about the origins of the food shortage in many African countries, except on one point, your conclusion. I don't think there is a real technical solution. I think that there is a political will which will be able to give the conditions to the peasants to produce their own food and to produce surpluses. The political will be translated into facts once they will be given, once the peasants will be given the access to credit, access to technical possibilities, but especially once the pressure which is applied on them will be lifted.
I think that one can't deny that war is a major factor in the creation of famine in Africa today. That doesn't mean that there aren't other famines that have existed in the past where war was perhaps less important than other man-made causes. But natural causes are not primarily the causes of famine in Africa or anywhere else in the world. In looking at the causes of famine in a place like Ethiopia, again, we can give a whole long list of what the causes of famine are sitting here in Cambridge. But it seems to me quite important to talk to the farmers about why they didn't produce a crop in a year. And that was not done in 84 or 85. And it's not being done in 87 or 88. If you want to find out why there is a decline in food production, ask the people producing food. It's very simple on the surface. It's very hard to do. But that's where you begin to understand. And then you see that the effect of armyworms, insect pests, the effect of weeds, the effect of other so-called natural things like the ending of rains early in the agricultural cycle are in fact heightened by military activity which delayed planting for 3 weeks. The so-called natural factors become bound up in the military factors, and the military issues do become very important.
If people in the audience want to ask questions, if you would begin to move to the microphones, we'll turn to you in just a minute, and we'll see if anyone... David, you want to get back into this, or James?
I'll just make one point, and that is that the fundamental question is moving from famine relief to development. A war atmosphere is not conducive for development. That's all there is to it. So, what has got to separate that out, that scenario? That's all. If you're talking about the issue on the agenda here. And if you're then largely talking about famine that results not from war, and if you're talking about famine that's not from war, it is preventable.
David? Yeah, Trevor.
I would just hope that listening to the group of us here, none of us know each other, although we know the organizations that we represent, but it certainly demonstrates the multiplicity of approaches that apply in a development process. You can imagine the kind of dilemmas that governments face in listening to all of us, assuming that we at some point would come together in a coherent point of view of what development is about. But you can imagine the problems that a government faces in trying to say, well, should I be listening to that institution, that organization, that institution? Development is a complex business.
Questions from the audience?
Excuse me. As a first step, then, what is something that all of you can agree on?
Give your name first.
Oh, my name's Eric Jansen. I mean, I don't know very much about this subject, but it seems to me that there is a lot of difference of opinion, although obviously you're all dedicated to the same end. But what is an agreeable first step? What needs to be done now that you can all pretty much agree on?
To do what?
Well, to deal with eliminating the problem. Well, okay, let me be more specific then. How, given the political situation that exists, and the natural factors and the given conditions, how can you begin in terms of to address long-term development? Because that seems to me the only solution ultimately. Can we agree on that? Some aspect of that.
I want to take one crack at that, and that is that if you go outside of the civil strife countries, there is a terrific need to get development schemes going. Development schemes are sidetracked by food emergency operations. It takes the energy of the government, it takes the energy of the donors, and the development schemes get on hold. To the extent that you can eliminate, by prior planning, those emergency food programs, you are speeding up the development schemes.
I would add to what James has said, that give the case of Mozambique, where they have civil strife, they have drought, they have famine. But they're saying that even within that kind of framework, there are secure areas where they're concentrating on development projects, while at the same time they're addressing the political process of how to resolve the crisis. I think, yes, emergencies of that sort divert attention, but at least you cannot ignore that some development must take place.
On the war scene situation, I just have one anecdotal bit. I was negotiating with somebody from a country, an African from a country in Geneva during the 84-85 situation. He was a high-up official, and we were trying to get food into that country out beyond where the government was willing to put it. And we negotiated for a couple of days in Geneva, and he finally agreed to go out a little bit. He defected. And I was talking to him a couple of weeks ago, and I said, what should we have done? What should I have done at that particular point in time to have gotten you to move a little faster when we knew the food was needed out there and your government wouldn't provide it? He said, you should have gotten more after your press. He said, we were getting a lot of support from your press, the liberal element of your press, and we were listening to them. And if they had gotten down on us, we would have taken more steps. That's his answer.
I'll just say this about development in a war situation. You can do some development in a war situation. You can do. I believe you can do some really good development if you're talking about working as a partner with an indigenous institution or organization. There's a man. Most of the United States food assistance that's going into Eritrea today is going through a man named Abapolos. And his people, who run 36 distribution sites and take the food from Massawa up to Asmara and distribute it right now, as we're here, to 450,000 people. There's no expatriates up there from CRS. He's doing that whole show himself. That same man has got the organization and he's got the inclination between 85 and now, and should more peaceful times come, to do development work. He's done development work up there. He's done massive tracts of terracing and check dams, clinics, and that sort of thing. So the strengthening of an institutional partner during a war or a famine, I think, is a very important part of development, and it can be done during this period.
David, you started out by saying that one could do development in a war-type situation, and you ended up by saying that one should strengthen institutional linkages during a wartime situation. I would agree with the latter very definitely, but you said he's giving out food at so many distribution points and he's waiting for peace to come back. There seems to me a little bit of a distinction there that's missing. During the worst of the situation in Eritrea, it's very difficult to do any kind of development.
All right, I agree. He's not doing check dams right now, and he's not doing terracing right now, but he is increasing his organizational capacity.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But he's also using, I presume, CRS-funded vehicles with CRS-supplied grain stores, which are all sitting along various routes, which in a matter of weeks the Ethiopian army could use in a massive offensive against Eritrea. And that's a very real possibility.
Well, you're right. It is a possibility. With stores on hand in Eritrea, the government of Ethiopian army could do that. It would be the end of PL 480 coming to Eritrea, regardless of what CRS might advocate or not. It would be cut immediately if that did happen.
I'm more concerned about people who live in Eritrea than PL 480.
This was the answer to the question.
No, but I mean, if you were saying, if your worry was that the government of Ethiopia would take the stores that were supposed to be dedicated to the victims, I'm saying that there's an alternative route, and that's across border from Sudan to get that food in. It wouldn't be coming in through the government of Ethiopia in Massawa if that happened.
But I think there's also another issue here, and that is the issue of making sure that there are expatriates on hand to monitor the distribution of food supplies from Western agencies. I don't care how good you think the local counterparts are. I think it's the responsibility of the agencies to monitor it themselves, because you put the local monitors, to the extent that they are good, in a terrible position. Their families, their own lives are on the line.
This was the answer to the question about on what first steps could they agree. We'll now turn to the next question.
Because this relates to that point that Mr. Holdren made. My name is Vivian Johnson, and I'd like to know how each of the organizations is working with Indigenous private voluntary organizations, Indigenous African private voluntary organizations in the countries in which you work.
Do you want to say another word, or shall we just go down the road?
We, as Médecins Sans Frontières, we don't work with indigenous private organizations. We work with official health structures as much as we can, because of course, most of the health activities are run by public services. This is the reason why, as much as we can, we work in very close relationships with the local government. And I want to say that in 90% of the cases in Africa, this is the case.
We work, quite recently, UNDP established a division for non-governmental organizations, and the major focus is to ensure that we identify and work with non-governmental organizations within the country, and we try to ensure that the balance is kept in favor of those private local organizations. For example, again I use the Mozambique case, the NGOs have an efficient network throughout the provinces where the multilateral organizations do not have an effective presence, and we tend to work through them, and they themselves, whether it is CARE or Oxfam or Child Survival or what have you, are linked into a national NGO. So that we're trying to design means of working through them in that situation in Mozambique, but that's where our push is at present.
We do not work through states, and consequently haven't had to deal with the situation in Ethiopia, because we wouldn't work there providing relief or development, because there's no other way to do it except through states. I think if you're looking at indigenous NGOs in Ethiopia, you have to be very careful. Such things as the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Red Cross. These people are paid their salaries by the government. Now, these are not local, I think, NGOs in any kind of Western sense of the term at all. There are some religious organizations that are more independent, and they've also been persecuted. And I think their position is fairly tenuous. Makani Jesus, for example, some of the other churches. The option of peasant associations as local grassroots organizations in Ethiopia is also not terribly attractive. Local leaders are appointed by the state and elected by the local peasant association. The local leaders also, for the most part, belong to the party. So this is also, I think, something that's not to be considered a local NGO.
I don't work for AID anymore, but from having lived in 7 African countries, my strong feeling is that none of us in the development community work enough with private organizations in these countries. And I broaden it to outfits like private consulting firms. The training that's gone on for the past 25 years in this country, elsewhere, in Africa, as you know, there are an awful lot of Africans, very well educated, making terrible salaries. There's no reason why development agencies should not be picking them up to do the analytical work that we bring people over to do at great expense. There's a huge amount of room for that kind of thing. I'm talking about economists, sociologists, anthropologists.
Hi, my name's Ben. I'm a student here at Harvard. In the short term, it seems some of the short-term fixes can be taken care of with some of the relief. And Mr. Kelly mentioned better logistics. You could do a better job with relief. In the medium term, development. But in the long term, and I didn't hear anyone mention this in their development talk, it seems like you need to couple long-term development with awareness about population control, because there are at least two sides of the problem. And I'm just curious, how much a factor is population control in the long term, and how much of your development efforts are directed towards educating those populations about population control? And what sort of obstacles do you need to overcome?
Also, just a few words. I think that we should be careful not to invert the terms of the problem. The best birth control system is development, and I wouldn't say that birth control generates development. This is generally what is understood. Generally, people think that the main obstacle to development is the population growth. But when you look throughout the world, countries, which are heavily populated, have been through a period of development very, very quick, mainly in Asia. And in Africa, where the population is not that high, development is not appearing. You have to understand that the main social security for any basic family is their children. As long as there is no social coverage once you're old, the only people who will feed you, who will take care of you, are your children. Therefore, you've got to make many children. So the best way to space the births, to control demography, is development, and not the other way around.
I disagree with that.
I know it's not very orthodox.
There are the two sides, and you've heard them debated. It's just that when you start talking about population in Africa, yes, there's plenty of land there. However, in Asia, the Green Revolution was largely instrumental over the past 30 years in helping to compensate for the population explosion. And we have no Green Revolution coming on stream for Africa. There has been very little advance in dryland agriculture. The amount of research money going in there is negligible compared to the amount of research money that went into the Green Revolution 30 years ago with the Rockefellers. There is a big problem of the budgets in Africa cannot support the people that are being born, and African leaders know this. Now there is the cultural problem that African leaders and many Africans, for religious reasons, are not in favor of population planning. I tried it in a couple of countries because I tried to give some assistance money for it because I did detect among people an awareness of the problem and an inclination to do something about it. I found working with women was the best way to do it. They usually see it as an emancipation issue in the country, and they usually have the ear of the president. And if you get the ear of the president, things happen. And the last place I tried it was in Mogadishu, and they have a very fine program going there. Mm-hmm.
We'll move to the next question.
Yeah, it seems to me that countries that have made, developing countries that have made some significant strides, truly significant strides in development, both on the population front and on food production, have done so largely without Western intervention. India sent the Peace Corps home. China closed its borders, and they've made some significant strides in bringing their situation under control. In Africa, do we have governments that are really serious about change and are willing to do some very painful things? I mean, these countries have taken some drastic measures, and albeit not ones we would support. And you know, where do we really fit in, and should we be there? I mean, I really wonder whether or not Francis Moore-Lepay et al. are sometimes on the right track, that until countries are willing to use some of the hard measures they need to themselves, not a lot's going to happen. Little strides will be made, but there won't be. Mali's a good case in point, in fact, because it wasn't until the U.S. and Canada cut off all their food aid in 1980 that they changed some of their policies that were, in fact, disincentives to producers. And since they changed the policies and paid peasants more to produce, peasants have produced more, and at least on paper, Mali's self-sufficient in food now. So that's one question, and then
that's I think
okay.
When you look at the people in the rows behind you, to ask questions. So, panel, you want
to respond? You know, okay. You think we'll agree on this?
Maybe. Well, just one word. I think that I agree with you. I don't think that the voluntary agency or international assistance can develop. I think they can aid a process of development. They can support, they can assist. But development comes from the society. It doesn't come from government. It doesn't come from organization, and especially from private voluntary organizations which come from outside.
We entirely agree on that.
So what are we doing in these countries?
But I think there are governments that are taking some painful steps, albeit it might be seen rather late. As I think James said earlier, the Green Revolution didn't take place in Africa, it took place in India. And India was able to rid itself of famine. There is a lot of work that's being done, research work in domestic food production, to try and reverse the trend that has developed through Africa for many years, introduced largely by external forces. The business of growing food for export. One has to use countries which are going back into basic research in domestic food that people have been eating, that people have known how to store, that people have known how to process. And this is certainly a very useful trend. It has to come from within. And external forces have to be sufficiently sensitive to what is consistent with the development process within those countries, and not to impose what we think are the development models. That, I think, is one of the problems that we face all the time.
Three issues. Oh, may I just comment on that?
Can you work this answer into another question, perchance? You don't
go ahead. Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
well, just I'll try to do it very quickly. There are countries in Africa doing very well, I mean, comparatively. Okay, you take Senegal, Cameroon, Malawi, Botswana. I mean, they're doing very well.
But their expatriate populations in these countries are very significant. I mean, Senegal and Ivory Coast, for example, there's more French there than there was.
I did mention Ivory Coast, but Cameroon, they're on all those. But there is an expatriate element, there's no doubt about that. Secondly, I think you're right about conditionality. Donors should not be giving aid unless there's conditions attached to it. And it should be a business-like kind of relationship and not a humanitarian type thing. That when you're talking about development, it should be business, strict business. And if they're not willing to do it, then you don't give the money. We've learned the lessons about what has to be done, and it's not imperialism by going in there and suggesting that those lessons have been learned. Okay? It's just good, hard, good sense. Finally, the revolution has gotten in the way in a lot of these countries, and they had to go through it. I mean, the revolution, I mean, each of the developing countries wanted their own revolution. I took Elliot Berg, you probably know his name, one of the leading economists in the United States, in to see one of the presidents, and the president on the way out said, don't pay too much attention to that socialism stuff that we're talking about. We're about to ease away from it, okay? I'm just saying that it's an evolving situation over there. I'm not suggesting anything about that particular country. I didn't even name it. But we have got to keep up with the evolving and keep conditionality in there.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Melissa Pearson, and I wanted to ask a question about the use of food as a political weapon. In the business school, we discussed the agribusiness industry, and it was posed that countries like the United States who have a surplus of food should use that food as an instrument to make sure that governments in other countries who are receiving that aid administer it in a way that we basically support, so that the food that we send is not used as a weapon or as a power, some sort of force. And I want to know what you all think about that.
Oh.
Yes. In terms of the U.S., PL 480 came about in the 50s, and it wasn't until 1973 that any mention of humanitarian uses of it was put into the legislation on PL 480. It was commonly thought of as part and parcel of a security package to be used in certain countries, such as Egypt, such as Iran, whatever, to help keep groups in power. But local governments use food very much as a weapon as well, and you shouldn't get away, lose sight of that.
You're saying we should use it as a weapon?
I'm saying it is used as a weapon around the world. I'm saying anytime you give food to a person or withhold it, you are exercising power over that person, over that situation.
I thought the question was, should we use it as a political? Is that the question?
Yeah, as an instrument of foreign policy.
Well, it's terrible. Of course not. No, it's we had that problem in 485 with Ethiopia, where there were people in our government who were arguing very strongly that administration was not in the interest of the people, and that if that administration could be toppled, the people could develop and have some development. Okay? But when they're starving, it seems to me it answers itself. You just have to ship the food in.
Thanks.
I think we'll take 4 more questions so you can count where you are on the lines and see whether you're going to be able to make it or not. We'll come over here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Andrew Michael. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Eritrean Relief Committee. My statement and question is directed to Mr. Holdren from Catholic Relief Service. He mentioned that you mentioned that 450,000 are reached through CRC.
Excuse me, did you say RRC?
No, you said the Catholic Relief Service, right?
Ethiopian Catholic Secretariat. Yeah.
Yes, through it. But being an Eritrean and going twice a year, which I have through Eritrea, this is not the case. But I don't want to really contest on that, because we have tried to approach the agency for years to work in the contested area, where most 85% of the people work, and they have refused on that ground. But since he mentioned with gracious that there is an intention that, especially during this crisis, that there could be a possibility for making cross-border operation, I really like to commend that, because this is what we are hoping to really get the message across from the panelists, because a few have been addressed about the war, except few to the panelists. The most important issue is the war, that have driven more than 1 million Eritreans outside and equal the same number displaced in the country. So what I'm trying to say, since you mentioned about the cross-border operation, would you tell to the audience and to your benefit, to people whom you depend for your money to be sent to Africa, that you will pledge, you will reach the Eritrean people through the the cross-border operation? If you do, can you mention that to us, please?
Well, this is what I'll say. We work with the PL4A U.S. Agricultural Surplus. The United States government is putting about 40%, perhaps 50%, through another American NGO, through Sudan cross-border operation. Okay, through ERA and REST.
Mm-hmm.
CRS has been working with the Ethiopian Catholic Secretariat, as you know, on the government of Ethiopia controlled area. As long as we can bring foodstuffs to people at risk of starvation on a regular basis, that no one is going to choose those people for us, no official person. When I say us, I mean the Ethiopian Catholic Secretariat. Mm-hmm. And that people who come to receive that aid in Eritrea now and will not be subjected to harassment. As long as we are convinced that those things are happening and the foodstuffs are available, we'll continue to feed those people on that side, on the government of Ethiopia's side. If we can't do that, obviously as a humanitarian organization, we will look for other ways to reach those people.
Thank you.
I disagree with you. I hesitate to disagree with an Eritrean as there is an American, but I do go to Asmara every trip, and I go every 2 months, and I meet with Eritreans, and I go to the centers, and I believe those statistics are accurate.
With due respect, the situation is not like that. Just a couple of seconds. Most of those that are given services, which we call food for work, is actually food for military purpose. And the Ethiopian government uses for conscription because it is wheat for war. It's the slogan that the Ethiopians use. So this has been documented. CBS recently just went to Eritrea. How the food that's been donated have been used by the Ethiopian military government troops. This is a document that have been last Thursday was broadcasted clearly by Dr. Na. And this is obviously understandable, but we are saying that there are no as such for 150,000 people that can be reachable through this avenue at the time. But since at this time I will be willing and happy to see anyone that would like to work through cross-border operation is the most important thing we'd like to hear, because this is critical period of time. And I thank you for that.
Thank you. It is now 9:30. I promised 3 other people the opportunity to ask questions. Can I ask you please to make them very brief, and then we'll...
My name is Glenn Fiskus. You all seem to have painted a pretty uniform picture in a mosaic that seems to paint the bad guy being a geopolitical problem. And I'm depressed from the picture you paint. It doesn't look very good. I think my question is if it truly is a geopolitical problem, what kind of an export of geopolitical solution should we export? I also get the feeling that the Russian communist regime is exporting a geopolitical problem. And what does your early warning system see as the next location of that problem?
I think what we cease to export is weapons and begin to export peace processes. And it looks like the Soviet Union is actually coming along to that line of reasoning as well. And Afghanistan may be the first of many withdrawals from at least supplying weapons in these kinds of conflict situations. But weapons are what keep the wars going, which is what prevents development and what certainly causes famine.
See anything like that in Central America?
Are you joking?
No, not the export of weapons, but the famine that's going to come. You see any signs that there is?
There was famine in Guatemala in '82 and '83. There was a beans or bullets program. There was a very similar program to the kind of relief efforts that happened in Ethiopia, and food was used as a weapon in Guatemala, very similar ways.
We agreed to open to all of Africa, but I'm not sure we want to open to Central America. But please, question.
My name is Opore Kwaro. I born, bred, and kicked about in Uganda. With regard to war, which I think must be accepted as the principal cause of famine in Africa today, in the Horn of Africa, Western Sahara, Chad, and Southern Africa, may I ask one question by way of a statement? I think we see in Africa today, for lack of a better word, a contrarization of people's movements. You have in Angola, you have in Mozambique, banditry in the name of, according to White House astrology, freedom fighters. Freedom fighters. This is a new phenomenon in a sense because it stretches to Central America and Afghanistan. I think the African people are saying, this thing is a major declaration of war, and we are treating the consequence, which is famine, in Ethiopia or in Mozambique and so on. To what extent then can we sit here in Harvard School of, government, and speak about famine without speaking about anti-apartheid in the case of Mozambique or in the case of Angola? The last question, the second question is, by way of a statement also, we have in the case of Eritrea, an African people demonstrating that after Zimbabwe, which demonstrated earlier than it, that it is possible to have independence without having to fall into the laps of one or the other superpower. We have in the case of Eritrea, a people that have created indigenous, meaning at the same time independent, institutions. I would like to ask NGOs or PVOs, as you prefer them on this side of the Atlantic, to respond to that question. Is it a threat? Are we not discussing the question of self-determination, in fact, even at the level of relief? If the people of Eritrea are able to distribute their food, why is their independence a problem? Their capacity to do so should be enhanced instead of being reduced. I say that given the map, the political map of Africa today, we have there a historic challenge to the question of self-determination.
That's a serious statement, which you politely couched as a question. And in fact, there are questions there. I'm going to thank you actually for your question and the statement implied in it too. Go to the last question, and then maybe when the panel responds, they can weave in their answer to your comments as well. Please, the last question.
Thank you. My name is Awash. I'm from Ethiopia, and I would like to make certain comments, primarily directed to development. I think the situation not only in Ethiopia, in Africa in general, it is very complex. We should understand the type of economies we have there, the type of infrastructure we have there, be it in agriculture or in health. And to respond or to react quickly under such situations is very difficult. We all agree on that, I think. And having said that, while relief aid is very important to solve the immediate problems, unless these relief aids are also at the same time complemented with development aids, with development programs, I think we are only wasting our time. One of the fifth question was why food shortage, why famine in Ethiopia after 84, 85? Well, simply because the question was not addressed. The roots were not addressed. Maybe we pretended to have addressed those questions. So, on the surface touch those questions, but we haven't addressed them at all. I'm sure the panelists have a tremendous experience on Ethiopia. I wonder what kind of really serious development programs are there in Ethiopia?
Could I ask the panel to respond in two-sentence responses, please?
I'd like to respond to the first part of the former question. I just came back from a meeting in Mozambique last week. It was an international appeal launched by the Secretary General of the UN for the emergencies for Mozambique. And for the very first time, in part because of the advocacy of the non-governmental organizations, the content of the political debate was significantly raised. And there were those who argued that you cannot continue, the major donor countries cannot continue to give, in the one hand, band-aid to a problem, while on the other side, permitting or condoning the activities of destabilization to take place from South Africa through the bandits. And for the very first time, political statements were made by one or two major governments which had not done so in the past, and there was actually a willingness to provide protection to emergency convoys which are going into insecure areas, and to provide protection for projects as well as for the civilian population. And this is a significant difference. It has not been done before, but now, aside from Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi providing some military protection on the routes going out of Mozambique, we had one or two major donor countries saying they were willing to consider this.
Any other panelists want to?
Well, I would just say on the bit about famine and civil war. You're certainly correct that civil war is one of the major reasons for famine in Africa. But, you know, AID is monitoring the Sahel zone. In other words, the drought-prone part of Africa. And that Sahel zone is larger than continental United States, and it extends from Ethiopia to Mauritania. I think the folks in West Africa would be a bit discouraged if they found out that you felt that there was no possible famine in West Africa. There's a great possibility, and it's being monitored very closely, but in 6 countries.
I have one word. I would like that people not confuse famine and underdevelopment. What we're dealing with is underdevelopment. Famine can occur in any part of the world, whether there is or not development. And in one word, I would say that one of the best ways, I wouldn't say the only one, just I want to be clear, but one of the ways to achieve development is democracy, because this is the only way the civil society can express and develop itself.
I'm not sure I understood you, but famine does not occur in a developed country anywhere in the world, okay? There is no starvation in a developed country. By famine we mean widespread starvation. That does not exist in the developed world, okay? It just doesn't.
Existed in Europe.
It only exists in 4 countries.
No, it has existed, no, let's be serious. I mean, it has existed in Europe very recently. I mean, 19th century.
I'm talking about in the last 40 years. There has not been a famine in a developed country.
Well, but the world didn't start 40 years ago.
No, but it is a phenomenon now that is associated with poor countries.
Does any other panelist want to have a 2-sentence comment?
Yeah, I just want to say something here, that we've been talking about Africa a lot and solutions to Africa, but by Africans. But there's some stuff, some people say, people I work with, that the problems in Africa can be best addressed here in the United States, and we haven't talked much about the inequitable trade policies. We haven't talked about the debt issue. We haven't talked about the insistence of the East-West superpowers of bringing African countries into those particular struggles. And I believe that NGOs such as CRS should be spending a much bigger part of their budget in global education to press the American public, to press their representatives in Congress to address those trade, debt, and the East-West conflict. That would do more for the situation in Africa, many of the things that we've been addressing today.
Jason, last comment.
2, actually.
1.
2. I agree that education should be a major part of any NGO's activities, but I don't think it should be the kind of self-serving fundraising education that goes out in promotional literature, which is often all it's limited to. Second, what kinds of development programs are taking place in some of these areas? In Ethiopia today, the 2 major programs that have been put forward by the government are Resettlement and Villagization. The impact of those 2 programs on production has been predicted by a number of people it's going to have such an adverse effect on production that within the next 5 to 8 years, production levels will have declined so that the food deficits are 3 to 4 times more than they are now. Imagine how many people they're going to be asking for donations for Ethiopian famine in 1993.
I'm sorry to have to do this. We've had the 4 questions that I promised. Would anyone who wants to discuss things, I suspect the panelists will stay a little bit longer.
You indicated that the problem in Ethiopia regarding agriculture is technological as well as economic. You also indicated that there is no direct relationship between war and famine. The facts indicate that the countries in Africa where there is a serious starvation, Southern Sudan, Eritrea, and Mozambique is a place where there is war going on. So facts indicate that there is direct correlation between war and famine. My question to you is, if governments are willing to take technological measures and economic measures, as you said, are you of the opinion that they would be able to deliver? Because in my opinion, it's not a question of demand and supply. In Ethiopia, supply is greater than demand right now, in Massawa and in Assaf. My question is, those people in the non-war-torn areas would be able to eat more, but would the government be able to deliver in areas where it does not have any control? So I think we're suffering from one fallacy. Only 1 or 2 of the panelists indicate that the core problem is political, and the solution is no demand and supply. It is political. Now my question to you is, assume the Ethiopian government is willing to take your macroeconomic policies, liberalize markets, align the currency, as you said, are you of the opinion that people will not be starving next year?
I don't think that starvation is a recent phenomenon in Ethiopia. I do agree that war plays a certain role. That has been discussed here, and I agree, certainly. All I'm suggesting is that if you can solve the war situation in Ethiopia or in any other country, the chances are you will begin to address more rationally the economic policies that need to increase your food production. So we have a problem, we have a war, you can't develop because of the war situation, you can't increase your domestic food production, you can't have stability, you can't have development. Agreed. You have to solve that, but you have to do other things as well. The other things are sometimes easier to do than solving the war.
The purpose of a forum is to open, explore, but rarely resolve issues. I think we've had an admirable forum in those terms tonight. There's been many disagreements. The disagreements arise precisely because there are different experiences, there are different values, and the issues themselves are multifaceted. One of our questioners said, to respond quickly under complex circumstances is difficult. He was characterizing response in an emergency situation. I would say that the same holds true for the panel, who did admirably in responding to complex questions quite quickly and in presenting their viewpoints quite quickly and insightfully. I think we all owe them thanks, and thanks to the audience and questioners as well.